Hi, it's Rob from the Bush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint Illuminor Szeras. So the first colour we're going to use is Citadel Black Templar Contrast Paint. I'm going to use this to do a lot of the little joints in his armour. Now on the legs this involves the round armoured joints, and then the same with the arms. Also got the back of his head, his hands, those kind of areas, and the kind of central column, almost spine thing going up his middle. When you're putting this on, I use this because it's a lot thinner than using a normal black paint. It's a lot easier to apply when you're covering little areas like this. So if you put it on and it looks a little bit too thin, you can just give it another second layer, that should be fine. Next up we're going to be using Citadel Leadbelcher. I'm going to use this to do all of the silvery metallic parts, such as the bottom of the legs, parts of his staff, and the kind of armoured loincloth that he's got dangling down between his front two legs. It's a very impressive miniature, this. Got tons and tons of details that take quite a while to paint, but it is worth putting in the effort for it. I try and cover all of those in this tutorial. Next up we're going to be using Citadel Runelord Brass, and we're just going to touch up all of those pieces of armour that he's got there. It's just going over the bits where it maybe got a bit of Black Templar on there, or the undercoat, which was Runelord Brass spray, hasn't quite covered the areas that it needed to. I'd say that it needed to, that the user needed it to, so a bit of user error. We can just use the normal Runelord Brass paint to touch that up, and that should be fine. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Canoptek alloy by Citadel. It's almost like a lighter shade of the Runelord Brass. Just going to do a few parts of him in this, such as the striped bit down the front of his head there, and a few other little areas that seem to be lighter when you look at pictures of the model. Didn't paint this for so long because I was pretty daunted by that kind of column of gooey liquid stuff flying up from the fellow, and then he's got a little swirl in his hands. He's also got that kind of bladed weapon where you've got the green to white to black, or green to white. Next up we're going to use a little bit of Moot green to paint all of the green glowing areas, such as the blades and the little beams of light coming from the blade, and also one from his finger too. But yeah, that column of goo, I wasn't too keen on painting that because I thought it'd take an absolute age to do and be a lot more difficult than it was. It's one of those where the actual miniature puts you off painting it because it's so big and I think quite daunting, the amount of time it's going to take to do. Next up is Citadel Ahriman Blue. We're going to use this on the two crystals on his staff, and also the weird thing that's on his shoulder there that looks like, I don't know, it should be a speaker or something, but it's not. I'm not entirely sure what it's meant to be. But the detail on it did put me off from doing this for quite some time. But thankfully one of the patrons put me up to doing this, with the voting for a miniature to be painted. So bit the bullet and started it. I'm glad I did, because it turned out really quite nice. Next up we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Rakarth flesh. I'm mainly using this on the guy who's lying down on the floor there, on his robes. You've got bits of his skull showing through as well. There's a skull on the floor underneath the concrete bits, which I'm not really going to be covering in this video, because depending on what colour you want to do your rubble, depends on what colour you're going to do that. So it's just Xereus and the poor chap who's lying down on the floor here that's going to be getting painted. Next up is Citadel Xereus Purple. I'm using this on the little swirly bit in front of his hands there. There's some great little effects you can do on this, and it does take a while to do them, but it does pay off in the end. I tried to paint the fluidy bit that's flying up from the fellow who's being flayed down there, using the same technique that I used on how to paint liquid drips, so I'll link that up when it gets to re-highlighting that part. It did take a while, but it's worth the effort. Next up, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Mephiston Red. I'm going to start painting this gooey bit. So I'm going to be doing the top with Mephiston Red, almost in full view of the camera. Doesn't help matters that it's not glued on perfectly well. I think I have mispositioned something when I was putting the guy together at the bottom, and so he's now at a slightly different angle from where these bits all join together, and so this is slightly looser than I think it should be really. Next up, it's going to be a little bit of pink horror, and we're going to do the next section down. Now, the way the red and the pink horror joins together, and the way the pink horror and the Emperor's Children joins together, is a bit jarring, but you'll see once that blends in, using the method of highlighting on both things, that they do all join up together without any worries. Once you've got that on, we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Emperor's Children. I'm going to paint the last part of the fleshy, liquidy kind of stuff that's coming out the bottom there. Like so. Now we're going to move on to the little chap at the bottom. We're going to use Citadel Kislev Flesh to paint him. Now when I was painting him, I realised that parts of his face are disintegrated, and then you've got the little bits at the top of his head where it's all getting disintegrated. And parts of his arms have already been flayed, like his hands and things like that. So there is parts of this where, as you're going along, you might see little bits change ever so slightly, where you apply some paint and then you start doing another colour and you realise that a bit that you've previously painted isn't actually skin, it's, I don't know, the fleshy bits underneath or something like that. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Balthazar Gold. We are using this to do the kind of armoured shoulders, or whatever it is that he's wearing. He's wearing some big massive shoulder pads that go down his back and have a vent on his back. That's what we're going to be using to paint this. Once you've got that layer on, we can move on to using a little bit of Citadel Khorne Red. I'm going to use this to do the trim of his robes on his sleeves, and also the two purity seals, which are one on his front and one on his back. Next up, we're using Citadel Mournfang Brown. I'm going to use this to do his boots, and he's got a little holster on one side and a little pouch on the other side, so you can do both of those with Mournfang Brown. Also has his belt going across as well, so you can do that too if you want to. Just give that a nice smooth layer of Mournfang Brown. We can move on to the next one. I'll also link up how I do the bases as well as a video to doing these kind of grey rubble bases. So I'll put one of them for you as well. Next up, we're going to be using a little bit of Vallejo Black. I'm going to use this just to do the soles of his boots, because the soles are quite distinct on this miniature. So just doing them with a nice matte black colour. Now it's a Vallejo Model Air Chrome. I'm going to use this to do two of the little pistons on his neck. I think one of the reasons I found this so daunting and it took quite a while to do is because you have so many different base colours and so many different sections that usually if you're doing a miniature and you put the base colours on, you think it doesn't look too good, and then you put the shades on, it looks better. Well, doing the base colours for this takes so long that you're looking at it in that condition for ages and ages and ages. So we're using a little bit of Citadel Retributor armour here to do the Aquila. But yeah, it takes ages to do these bits, and I think that I found that quite off-putting when I was doing it, because it took that long to get it all looking nice. Next we're going to be doing a little bit of Vallejo White. We're just going to do this on the globes around his body that you want to have that Tesseract glow, yellow-green glow coming from. As you see in this part of the video, it's made me realise that the one on his left wrist, I don't think I've actually put the Tesseract glow on yet, and I've finished the miniature. So I'll have to go back and add that. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Mechanicus Standard Grey. I started doing part of the base for the video, but the video is already hugely long, so I end up not doing the highlights and things for this base here, the rubble. All the rubble is though is Citadel Mechanicus Standard Grey washed with Nuln Oil. Then you're using Mechanicus Standard Grey again to put the colour back on, a little bit of Dawnstone to highlight, and a tiny little bit of white to highlight, then using a bit of a Grax and a bit of Athonian Camo Shade to mess that up a little bit. So now we're using Citadel Bieltan Green, and we are using this on all the bits that we use the Moot Green on. So the blades of his weapons, those kind of energy beams, the tubes, and that kind of thing. Like so. Now we're going for Citadel Drakenhof Nightshade. We're going to use this on the parts where we use the Ahriman blue, so those crystals on the blade, and also that weird thing on his shoulder. If you know what it is, sing out there, because I haven't got the rulebook for these yet, so I have no idea whether that's something that he can use or what, but let us know by all means. I'd be interested to find out what it's meant to be. Once you've finished that, it's on to the next shade, and the next shade is going to be Citadel Seraphim Sepia. I'm going to use this for all of this chap's robes. I'm going to use it for the bits of bone poking through his skin. Also the bones that are exposed from his hands, and the little gloopy bits at the end of his fingers where his bones are kind of being liquefied. Parts that we're not going to use this on that we usually would is the purity seals, because I want to make them stand out a little bit from the rest of the cream coloured cloth. So for the purity seals we're going to be using a little tiny bit of Citadel Reichland Flesh Shade in a moment. At the moment we're going to be using Citadel Nuln Oil. I'm going to use this on all of the areas that we use the Leadbelcher. That's the legs, parts of the staff, that kind of thing. You can see already from just putting these on that it really does bring out the detail in the miniature, stops it looking quite so flat. You'd also be using the Nuln Oil here if you were doing the base in a similar style to what I'm doing. So you can put that all over the Mechanicus Standard Grey if you wanted to as well. Next up we're going to use a little bit of Citadel Cryptek Armour Shade. This is the shade that was released with the Necrons. Comes out a little bit uneven. So you have slightly darker bits, slightly lighter bits, but I kind of like that. It makes it look a bit uneven and weathered, as if they've not been in the best care, which fits in with the story arc behind them. It's also got that nice glossy finish, so it does make them all shine. We want to put this on all the sections that you have the Runelord Brass or the Canoptek alloy. Next up is Citadel Grax Earthshade, the old favourite. I'm going to use these on the little gold bits, which is the 2 skulls on the end of his tassels there, and the Aquila. Like so. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Reichland Flesh Shade. I'm going to use this on his skin and the parchment for his purity seals. Like so. Next up, we're going to use some Citadel Snakebite Leather Contrast. I'm going to use this on his boots. So give each of those boots a nice coat of this, and I'll give them a nice leathery brown kind of look. Get in those recesses. I need the top parts of just this nice leathery kind of texture to them, I suppose, because it gives that slight shine. Now I'm going to use some Citadel Nuln Oil. I'm going to use this to do the holster and also the little pouch on his hip. Like so. Now it's going to be a little bit of Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm going to start by using this on the bottom of the gloopy bits, where we use the Emperor's Children. I'm going to run this up into the section where we used the pink horror also, and get that most of the way, so you're leaving a little bit of the pink horror at the top there, untouched by the Carroburg Crimson. Also use this to paint any exposed fleshy bits too. Now I'm going to use Citadel Druchii Violet. I'm going to use this on the top where you've got the Mephiston Red, and then that top little section of pink horror that you didn't put the Carroburg Crimson on. If you do this back to back, you can use a little bit of the Druchii Violet and mix that in with a little bit of the Carroburg Crimson that's still damp at the top of the pink horror section. Also using Druchii Violet on this swirly bit that he's got in his hands. Like so. Next we're using Reichland Flesh Shade Gloss. We are going to use this to do the Balthazar gold area that we did over his shoulders. So you just want to give that a nice coating of this. That'll get into the recesses and darken them up, but won't take away any of the shine, so he's got that nice shiny bit of armour on the top there. Now we're going to paint some Apothecary White contrast onto the sections that we just painted pure white. The reason we're doing this is this will add a little bit of darkness around the edges of the globes, whilst allowing you to just put a little highlight of white on them later on, and when you put that Tesseract glow on, it will make them stand out a lot better. Have darker edges and lighter middles. Now I'm going to start reapplying some colour. I'm going to start with Citadel Runelord Brass first. Basically we're going to be reapplying this to the armour panels on him. You don't want to go over the whole of the armour plates with this. You want to leave some of that Runelord Brass in there, in the details and the recesses, and also in areas where it looks like it's quite grimy, or it's dulled over and you've got those thick bits of shade. I quite like leaving some of them in place, as it does look like the metal is a bit mottled and tarnished. I'm going to use some Citadel Canoptek alloy. We're going to highlight the areas that we've just done, as well as reapplying this to the areas that we painted with Canoptek alloy originally, so like the top of his head there. While you do most of the Canoptek alloy parts that were previously that colour, and you give them a nice coat of it so it does stand out lighter, you're only doing highlights and things on the rest of the Runelord Brass parts so that they remain darker and you can see the difference between the two sections. Now adding a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome to the Canoptek alloy just to lighten that up a little bit more, and we're now just going to be mainly doing edge highlights and bits of detail work on these, so you're going to pick out the underside of any of the dents and the scuffs. Also along the areas where you highlighted with the Canoptek alloy, you're also going to do about a third of those areas with this too, just to highlight those. This will really make them stand out and give them a nice kind of gleam to those metal sections. Those parts done, we're going to move on to Citadel Leadbelcher and start working through the sections that we painted with Leadbelcher earlier. Now you do want to leave some parts of these with the Nuln oil on the flat them, because I wanted to make them look quite dirty and grimy. So these sections I'm doing the top part with Leadbelcher and then leaving the Nuln oil showing on the flat surfaces slightly lower down on each section. We'll be doing the same for that metallic loincloth in the middle there. I'm going to use a little tiny bit of Stormhost silver from Citadel. I'm just going to use this to highlight the edges where we've used the Leadbelcher, just to give them that little bit of extra shine, make those stand out. Checking here to see how well it worked as a kind of replacement for Vallejo Model Air Chrome. It does a decent enough job. Don't think it's got quite as much pigments in there, so it doesn't make it quite as shiny, but it's reasonable. Now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Balthazar Gold. I'm going to redo the colour on this guy's shoulder ornamentation. Still not too sure what that's meant to be. Unfortunately, it looks like the camera lens had a bit of a smudge on this section. It does look slightly fuzzy. Filmed through the Mark I potato. Now I'm going to reapply some Citadel Retributor armour. I'm going to use this to highlight the Balthazar Gold as well. Just not going too overboard on the highlights here. I want to leave this quite dark. So you're just mainly picking out details and some flatter areas and just adding a slightly more golden colour to it than that browny gold it was before. By just adding these, it does maintain that dark gold colour. I'm going to start on this skin here. Now this is where the layers get a bit choppy and we're jumping from one to the other. Because when he's working out what to paint next, he's got that many different sections and layers to his face and the bone showing through and all that. There is a bit of skipping between ones here, so it might stop partway through doing one layer. Or we'll finish that layer and then rather than carrying on doing extra bits of skin or extra bits of bone or anything like that, we'll go to another one. It's just because I found it easy to do it this way, as it builds up the different layers of different sections as you're going through it, because on his face there you've got teeth, bone, bits of flesh, skin, you name it, all showing through in different parts. So I'm sort of skipping between them all just so you can kind of see which parts are going where. And it's also a lot easier when painting, I thought, to do it this way, because I can see what I'm meant to be painting and what I'm meant to be highlighting next. So the Rakarth flesh here is being used to paint all the bone on his face. So he's got the cheekbone and part of his temple on one side. He's got a little bit just below his nose on one side. He's also got parts of his skull there, and also the bones of his fingers on both hands. Next we're mixing a little bit of Citadel Ushabti bone with the Rakarth flesh. I'm just going to be touching up those bone sections that you've got showing through there. So his hands, the little bits in his face, his scalp. I thought doing it this way is doing all the bottom parts first before starting on that fluidy bit. Will just help me see where that fluidy bit's going, so if I wanted to touch anything up or change anything a bit later, it's a bit more obvious. For now we're working on the bone colours. Next up, it's some pure Ushabti bone. I'm going to be using this to highlight all the bone sections. Just want to think about where the light's hitting them and doing the highlights on the top edges and the top surfaces. You can also use this to do some highlights on that kind of, I suppose, swirly bit of liquid bone which is flying out the top of his fingers there. like so. So we're going to return to the skin now. We're going to use a little bit of Kislev flesh and mix in a little bit of Vallejo white. And we're just going to start doing highlights on the sections of skin which haven't been flayed off. I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Carroburg Crimson, and just around where these wounds are, on the side of his face where you can see the bone showing through, I'm just going to use a little tiny bit of Carroburg Crimson to add the redness to them where you'll be able to see underneath the skin. So surrounding those little sections of bone, you're going to have that little bit of redness to it. I'm just putting that in there so you can distinguish it from the actual skin tone, so the bone shows clearly being revealed. I'm going to use some Citadel Rakarth flesh and start working on his robe, using a little bit of Vallejo white mixed in to start doing some highlights. Rakarth flesh here was reapplied when we did the bone earlier. So if you haven't put a layer of Rakarth flesh back on here, you can do that now and start doing the highlights afterwards. Like so. I'm going to add a little bit more white to the Rakarth flesh mix we've just used. I'm going to highlight the robes a little bit more, thinking about where the light's catching them, so you want the light on the top surfaces, not going too far round. You definitely don't want to be highlighting the underside of anything, so try and keep those highlights on the top. It's going to be the last section for part 1 of this tutorial, because it's a pretty hefty one, it's really long, be about an hour otherwise. We'll continue in part 2. So this is how it's going to look at the end of part 2. We'll be coming on to that in a week or so's time. I've added some pictures of the finished results as well, so you can see these after the outro. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much. If you like the channel and you enjoy the content and you'd like to support us, you can head to our Ko-fi or Patreon pages, linked below. Thanks very much.